Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a concept that's absolutely key to understanding modern India, but, it's often really misunderstood: secularism. And this isn't just some political buzzword. It's a living, breathing idea that was forged during India's independence and is constantly being tested and reshaped in the nation's courts.
Okay, so first things first, let's get a common misconception out of the way. When most of us hear secularism, we immediately think of the Western model, right? That strict wall between church and state. But in India, it's a totally different ballgame. It's not about a clean break between religion and government. It's a lot more complicated than that.
So in this explainer, we're going to trace this really unique idea all the way from its philosophical roots, through those intense founding debates, and right up to its biggest tests in India's highest court. So what does secularism actually mean in a place like India, a society that is so profoundly religious and incredibly diverse, where faith is it's a huge part of everyday public life for millions and millions of people? See, the Indian model isn't anti-religion, not at all. It doesn't try to ignore faith. Instead, it's all about actively managing religious diversity. The main idea here is fairness. The state has to treat every single faith with equal respect, a principle you might hear called Sarva Dharma Samabhava. But, and this is key, it also gets to step in when it's needed for social reform.
Okay, so let's get into how this unique approach came to be. Its roots are planted deep in the historic and often heated debates that happened when India's constitution was being written.
The founders, they have this massive choice to make. Should they just push religion into the private sphere, completely separate from public life? Or should they figure out a way for the state to coexist with and even protect all of India's different religions? That was the big question on the table.
Well, they chose coexistence. And they built a really unique set of secular principles right into the DNA of the Constitution, creating a legal framework that's pretty much unlike any other in the world.
Think of the Constitution as having this whole toolbox just for secularism. It's got layers of protection. You've got rules against discrimination, guarantees of religious freedom, a ban on using taxpayer money to promote any one religion, and special protections for minorities. It's all these things working together that build the foundation for India's unique path.
And this right here, this is the core operating principle. This idea of principled distance is the absolute heart of the Indian model. It's not a rigid wall. It's more like a flexible boundary. The state can step in closer to fix a social injustice, or can step back to respect a community's autonomy. The guiding light for all of it? The values written into the Constitution.
But, a blueprint is just a plan on paper. How do you actually protect it? How do you enforce it, especially when it gets challenged? Well, that's where the Indian judiciary comes in, playing the role of the ultimate guardian.
To protect the Constitution's very soul, the Supreme Court came up with this incredibly powerful idea, the basic structure doctrine. It's basically a firewall. It says that yes, Parliament can change parts of the Constitution, but it can never destroy its fundamental pillars. And, as the court would later make crystal clear, secularism is one of those pillars.
And this whole doctrine faced a massive test back in 1994, in a case that would honestly change the legal definition of Indian secularism forever. The S.R. Bommai case. And there it is, the court's powerful verdict. In this one judgment, the Supreme Court declared, with absolutely no ambiguity, that secularism was a non-negotiable part of India's basic structure. It was a clear line in the sand. If a state government acted against the secular idea, it could be thrown out of power. All right, so we've seen the legal theory. Now let's see how these principles actually get applied in the real world, especially when individual rights smash right up against deeply held religious traditions. Our first case starts back in 1985, and it's about a 62-year-old Muslim woman named Shah Bano. All she wanted was basic financial support from her ex-husband, but her fight for it just ignited this national firestorm over religious law, women's rights, and what secularism really means on the ground.
The Shah Bano case was a total legal and political roller coaster. First, the Supreme Court sided with her, using secular law. But then, a huge political backlash pressured the government to pass a new law that basically reversed her victory. But the story doesn't stop there. Years later, in a really clever legal move, the court reread that same law to essentially bring back her right to alimony. It's just a perfect example of this constant tug-of-war between secular law, religious codes, and raw political power.
Our second case is a lot more recent. It centers on the Sabarimala temple in Kerala,
where for centuries, a tradition blocked women of menstruating age, basically between 10 and 50, from entering the main shrine.
The Supreme Court's 4-1 decision was a huge deal. The majority argued that the ban violated fundamental rights to equality and said that, when it comes down to it, the Constitution's values have to win out over religious tradition. But it wasn't a clean sweep. The lone dissenting judge, Justice Indu Malhotra, made a really powerful argument on the other side. She basically said that courts shouldn't be deciding what's right or wrong in religion, and that true secularism means respecting a community's beliefs, even if you don't agree with them. The fact that the court itself was so divided just shows you how thorny these issues really are.
So here's the most important point. What these cases show us is that Indian secularism isn't some finished product, set in stone. It's a constant, living, and often very tough negotiation.
So let's just quickly sum up the big takeaways here. First, India's model is totally unique, built for its specific context. Second, it's not anti-religion, it's about making sure all faiths are treated with equal respect. Third, the courts are a huge part of the story, constantly shaping what secularism means in the real world. And finally, this whole thing is a dynamic process. It's a constant balancing act between individual rights and community traditions. This story is definitely still being written.
And all this leaves us with one final big question. As countries all over the world are struggling with diversity and identity, the Indian experiment, with all its successes, failures, and contradictions, is just a fascinating story. And that challenge of trying to keep this delicate balance between faith, freedom, and the law, well, it's more relevant today than it has ever been.